It is a good thing we don't hold the U.S. government to the same standards we do Apple. The company sells only 5 million iPhones and investors sell the stock. Imagine if we demanded the same results from Washington. I think we would have long ago sold the country. Welcome, everybody. I'm Neil Cavuto, and that is the difference between Apple and Washington. One sets the standard, and the other has no standards. One's reputation is such that selling billions of dollars worth of iPhones in just a few days can be deemed a disappointment, and the other routinely loses $4 billion a day, and it just warrants a shrug. Why? The question isn't so much why we hold Apple to such unrealistically high standards. The question is why we don't hold the government to any standards, never punish for programs that fail, and money that is consistently wasted. The stimulus checks to prison inmates, the solar push for panels made in China, the government-subsidized checks to Chevy Volts that don't sell, and exploding healthcare costs that don't end. Trillions spent on stimulus that doesn't stimulate, and regulations that stifle our very ability to innovate. In the private sector, companies would be pummeled for any one of these disappointments in business. In the public sector, just part of the government doing business. But here is the difference. Investors could sell, taxpayers cannot. That doesn't mean you should sell Apple. All it means is that with the government, you don't have the option. Because unlike Apple, you are always stuck with a lemon. What's wrong with expecting more from our government and getting more for all the money we pay to government? What is wrong with aspiring to be more like Apple and less like a lemon? Here to thrash it out, wealth manager Larry McDonald and the Independent Women's Forum's Sabrina Schaeffer. Sabrina, on that, why not hold the government to an Apple-like standard?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head in your intro. I mean, in government, there is no market. In the private sector, there's only one metric that matters, and that is the bottom line. But in the public sector, there's so many different variables that go into decision making, from ideology to values to revenue to perceptions of fairness. So it's much harder to hold the government accountable.
You know, Larry, I'm not asking for a high benchmark, even though I would love to see it. But we're grateful if we're not wasting as much money as we thought, if the numbers aren't as awful as we feared. What's happened to us?
We're leaving one thing out of the equation, Neil. It's risk. If you look at the Federal Reserve itself has taken on $3 trillion of balance sheet risk, about $500 billion more in the last couple of weeks with this new measure they took. There's no exit strategy, so not only have they not delivered enough jobs, but they've taken $3 trillion worth of risk, $3 trillion, without really getting us the jobs, and we have the risk reward, which is really poor.
Right.
You know, what's interesting about that argument, that Sabrina, we're like buying a high-flying internet stock, but we're not flying high. In fact, we are a greater risk than some of the riskier investments on Wall Street, simply because we've been, burning money like crazy in Washington.
That's right, and one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is the fact that government agencies are rewarded for spending more money by getting higher budgets for the next year. So while the private sector is thinking, how can I streamline things, how can I work more efficiently? I mean, let's think, would Steve Jobs ever be talking about any of these issues, fairness or values, or would he be saying, how can I make the best product most efficiently, most effectively, and most affordably? Those are not terms that the government thinks about.
To make them affordable, of course, he shipped the manufacturing overseas, but that's a whole other issue. But Larry, to our unwillingness to hold the government accountable or to shrug our shoulders when it's not, I think that now is built in. Politicians expect it. They know that we might whine and moan a little while until the next debt ceiling fiasco, but then we'll move on. What do you think?
Well, I think that the rubber's really going to meet the road, Neil, in really November, between November 10th and December 15th or so. This fiscal cliff is going to be showcased in front of the nation, and it's potentially $640 billion of tax increases and spending cuts. They're probably going to do a deal somewhere in the $200 billion range. But that's where the rubber's going to meet the road, because all these promises are really going to come closer and closer and closer to really a reality when they kind of work out this fiscal cliff.
Let's say whatever they cobble together, Sabrina, is enough to keep, I guess, the company, the country in this case, viable for another few months, but realistically not. We'll accept it, we'll breathe a sigh of relief, but it's short-lived, isn't it?
That's right. And I think one of the problems is that there are diffuse costs and there are concentrated benefits. So you and I don't necessarily feel it when we know that there's 5 government agencies doing the same thing at times, same project. But the people who are benefiting from that, they know, and they're out there and they're voting, and they are making a big deal up on Capitol Hill. And so it gets very difficult to try to reverse direction. But I think that we are in for a scary awakening this year.
You know, Larry, we mentioned Apple. It must say something about our recovery right now, that maybe half a percentage GDP point is pegged to the success of these darn phones. Where have we come and what have we done where that's the reality?
Well, you got to look at the whole picture, Neil. I've been blogging about this. My website's lawrencegmcdonald.com, and I really want people to look at technology. I think technology is really costing the U.S. a lot of jobs. Look at Apple. My wife and I used to have 2 PCs. Now we have a PC and an iPad. I think if you look at the Hewlett-Packard stock or Dell stock, you can see the real decimation that the iPad and some of the Apple products are really hurting other technologies. And other companies like Amazon, what they've done to Best Buy. Best Buy shut 70 stores around the U.S. in the last year and a half. So there's a really interesting dynamic playing out with technology that you have to really dig into a little bit.
Real quickly, Sabrina, you could argue that it's creating other industries, burgeoning industries, but I'm not here to argue that, to the point that we will never be emulating the Apple model anyway in our government, and that's what I find regrettable. What say you?
That's right. I mean, we have elections, we have the opportunity to vote people out of office, but when we're dealing with a bureaucratic state that is as large and as unwieldy as the one that we are today, it gets very, very difficult.
All right, guys, thank you both very, very much. Here is another